would be shared to all the participants after every program, and this would be done after the session is over. So today also, once the session is over, or at the end of the session, we will share the link to each and every participant. Post session, the scientific notes and modules of respective session would also be shared with 8 participants. Moreover, after the completion of all the 7 programs, the participants who have participated in this program would be receiving an award with regards to certificate of appreciation, and it would be approved by the respective faculties. Apart from this, there is also a special reward for top 3 students who we will be including in our med-ed services, like which is given by RPG Life Sciences. These services include publication of thesis, research articles, drafting manuscripts, stat publications, posters, latest e-books, and any other customized request which would be there from the PG students. So this is the complete highlight of the program which we are going to follow throughout the 7 series. Next slide, sir. Now, coming to the topics which we would be covering in this nephrology post-graduation program. We have total of 7 sessions, which is mentioned over here in the slides. These are the topics which we have selected with the feedback of doctors of all the PG students. The first session on the kidney transplant, past, present, and future, has already been completed. It was steered by respected Professor Dr. Chako Jacob sir. And this session is available on YouTube also. If during the end of the session, we can share the link also in the chat box. The second session on long-term post-transplant complication is basically today, and for which we have with us our respected speaker with us, to whom we will introduce you shortly. So the remaining 5 sessions mentioned here would be conducted subsequently. So total there would be 7 sessions. 1 session is over and 1 more session is today, and after that we will have 5 sessions, and followed by that we would have 2 extra sessions based on the request of PGs. So this is all about the program modules, program highlights, and what is the benefits and features for the PG students.
Thank you so much for Dr. Vishwanath to grace the occasion today. And he's one of the eminent speaker and eminent personality in the field of nephrology, and in the topic called as management of long-term post-transplant complication. I would request Dr. Mangesh to just introduce Dr. Vishwanath, please.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much for welcoming our today's faculty, Dr. Vishwanath sir. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Vishwanath sir. I'm Dr. Mangesh Balera, heading the medical department. So to make it short, I have prepared a slide for his introduction. So Dr. Vishwanath sir is presently associated with Manipal Hospital, Bangalore, as head of the department nephrology. He has done the DNB Nephrology, DNB Paediatrics, and the most important, he is the member secretary of ethics committee, which is one of the very key job to approve the many clinical studies based on the ethics and the and it is quite honorable job. So he is honorary secretary of Southeast Branch Indian Medical Association. As I said, he has 23 publications in national and international journals. He has been speaker for national and international conferences. He is member of various societies, active, and he is very active in the all these societies related to nephrology. Basically, he is very active, and he is very good teacher, I would say, and he himself believes in training the postgraduate students in nephrology. It's our pleasure to have him today with us as a teacher, and he has very special interest in clinical nephrology, renal transplantation, hemodialysis, multi-system problems, and pediatric nephrology. So thank you so much, sir, for joining us today. I would like to hand over forum to you. Over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Mangesh. Thank you, Sanjeev ji. Thank you, Avinash.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Sanjeev and myself, we know each other more than 2 decades.
Yes.
We have been associated with very many academic programs. Thanks, Mangesh, for that wonderful introduction. I consider myself as a student. So as long as you are in medicine, you are a lifelong student. So it's only a knowledge sharing which we need to do. In fact, with our students, we are more like colleagues and friends, because as long as you're in medicine and practicing medicine, you are a lifelong student. So I consider myself as a student even in this forum. So it's only a knowledge sharing. That's it. So today we will discuss about long-term post-transplant complications. At the outset, I would like to thank RPJ Life Sciences for this wonderful opportunity. In fact, it is very difficult to speak after Professor Chaco, who is a teacher and who was the examiner for most of us. So it will be very difficult to carry on the torch here, because after Dr. Chaco's talk, we can never equate his talk. So we will be only
he recommended your name, sir.
Absolutely.
He recommended your name for a next session.
Thank you. He is my guru and he was my examiner and he is my teacher. And in fact, whenever we are in trouble, we look at him for some ray of hope and advice. So it is indeed a great honor for being invited here. Thank you. Thank you very much. I would like to cover my topic today in the following headlines. Basically, what is transplant outcome? What are the current outcomes of transplant? What is the survival rates of both patients and graft survival? What are the risk factors associated with various issues post-transplant? And of course, topic for today being long-term complications, and how do we manage these long-term complications? And to conclude, how do we go? The opening statement here would be basically a transplant is not like a short run or a 100-meter run. It is like a marathon. So we have to make sure that our patients run the longest possible marathon, and we hope that they run a full marathon. As of now, if you look at full marathon, I think if I'm not wrong, it's around 41 or 42 kilometers. So hopefully we want our patients to survive with the working graft throughout their life. That's the hope. So when we start counseling any patients for the transplant, they will ask us, I'm sure most of you, when you are coming across transplant patients being worked up, they'll ask you, doctor, how long my kidney will come? How long I'll survive? So I'm sure all of us would answer saying the best outcomes are seen in transplant, but transplant is not like a simple fixing a part in a machine or in a garage, what my teachers used to say. So it is like, for some people it may come shorter, for some people it may come longer. On an average, we can speak about the numbers, what we come across or what is seen in United Nations organ sharing data system, which is the most robust system available as of now. The survival at 1 year with a living donor is definitely better than a cadaver donor. So living donor would be almost 99% graft survival at 1 year, and 5 years 91, and 10 years being around 77% graft survival we are talking about. And whenever there is an expanded criteria donor, obviously the survival of the graft comes down, and equally the patient survival also comes down. So this is the adjusted survival rates, as you can see. And few definitions you should know here. It is called as graft half-life. It's not written here. Graft half-life is, by definition, 50% of the kidneys working at the end of so many years. So graft half-life, if you look at live and cadaver, around 12 to 13 years is an average live donor graft half-life, and 8 to 9 years is average cadaver donor, what is called as graft half-life. Meaning at the end of 12 to 13 years, if you have done transplants for 100 people, 50 grafts will be still working, with the patient surviving, of course. So this is the survival rates, percentage adjusted survival rates. As you can see here, graft survival at the end of 10 years is almost to the tune of 60%. This is the data around maybe 5-6 years ago. And patient survival goes along with that. And as you can see, graft survival will be always lesser than the patient survival, because patient may lose the graft, but will go back on dialysis and maybe looking forward for another transplant. So if you look at adjusted survival rates here, it's the same representation what we saw in the graph. At 10 years, almost 60% of the grafts will be working. So what are the risk factors of developing end-stage renal disease? World over, it's been, as you can see, even from the UNOS data, diabetes is the #1 cause. Next comes the glomerular diseases and hypertension, nephrosclerosis. For the last couple of days, maybe because of the better management of glomerular disease or diabetes being higher, diabetes and hypertension, nephrosclerosis is going up by the virtue of its presence and by the virtue of more number of patients having diabetes much earlier. Especially same true with our country also, where India is being called as a diabetic capital of the world. So obviously we have more diabetics, younger people coming at an younger age with diabetes related complications. So obviously diabetes related kidney disease is going up. Even if we had looked at our own data in our hospital, in dialysis patients, 60% of the ESRD patients were diabetics. So to say, the diabetic ESRD is the highest cause for end stage renal disease. So if you look at the cause of death in anyone with transplant, the most common cause is cardiovascular disease. It holds good for even people on dialysis. On dialysis also, the highest cause of death is cardiovascular. Almost 60 to 70% of the deaths on dialysis are due to cardiovascular. In transplant also, it is because of various reasons. Cardiovascular mortality is the highest among the patients dying with a functioning graft. So other major causes of death include diabetes, end-stage renal disease itself, and infection in our country, malignancy to a smaller extent. So what are the causes of this late graft loss? I am sure all of you are familiar with this. Basically, we classify them into immunological and non-immunological. Immunological, some factors we may have control and some factors we may not have control. What are those factors? Couple of them would be unidentified subclinical rejections, chronic rejections, which will not be able to control completely. So where we will discuss about de novo DSA when I come to my talk in the later slides. And of course, the immunity of the patients, both cellular and autoimmunity, which many of us may not have full control on, even at the best of the hands and with good immunosuppression. So it could be again both related to donor-host mismatch, various subclinical inflammation, infections, and to some extent inadequate immunosuppression. Inadequate immunosuppression is something which is in our hands. So we need to be very diligent about handling immunosuppression in a transplant patient. It's a tightrope balance. It is nothing like maths. It is more of an art. Many of my seniors feel handling immunosuppression in a transplant patient is an art rather than a science. Many times it may be very difficult decision which way to go. Non-immunological factors like age, cardiovascular comorbidities, and some amount of delayed graft function also affects the chronic dysfunction of a graft. And of course, unmonitored usage of nephrotoxic drugs, and CNA nephrotoxicity itself can cause graft dysfunction over a period of time. And other causes I'll come to in my next few slides, that is diabetes, dyslipidemia, hypertension, and infection. So the long-term complications, first and foremost, is cardiovascular complications, which includes hypertension, dyslipidemia, and diabetes. In fact, diabetes can also recur in the new graft. So that's the reason we need to be more stringent about control of diabetes and hypertension. Of course, once there is failing graft, chronic kidney disease complications like anemia and bone metabolism, and transplant-related complications like allograft dysfunction, infections, and malignancies, which may take a toll on the kidney functions and also patient survival. Here again, whether it is acute graft dysfunction or chronic allograft dysfunction, is the one which matters. In most of the times in acute graft dysfunction, I'm sure we'll be able to do something. Many a times in chronic allograft dysfunction, we may not be able to do much, especially if it is a chronic active antibody-mediated rejection or a recurrent glomerulonephritis. Of course, we should not forget about general health complications, including preventive care and pregnancy, which may not be sometimes as smooth as people expect after a transplant. Coming to cardiovascular complications in the initial part, definitely hypertension, dyslipidemia, diabetes are a significant contributors for the cardiovascular complications. Don't forget about obesity. Most of the times after transplant, patients tend to gain very heavy weight, and then they may develop obesity related complications. And of course, we need to drill the patients, make sure they don't take tobacco and avoid alcohol or limit the alcohol. Many times we have seen patients, once they feel all right after transplant, they feel everything is all right and they go back to their old lifestyle of again smoking, tobacco usage, and which may be more harmful. Hypertension is very, very relevant cardiovascular risk factor in a transplant patients, and most of the times there is evidence to show 60% of the transplant patients have hypertension sometime or the other, and it can affect as high as 80% of the transplant patients. The goal of treatment would be to keep the blood pressure less than 130/80, and again here we need to see if there is any proteinuria, and if the proteinuria is more than 1 gram, we need to be more stringent in controlling the blood pressure. Apart from regular essential hypertension, there are few specific factors which can contribute to post-transplant hypertension, especially what is the primary kidney disease of the patient, what is the quality of the donor organ, if it is a marginal donor, if there is a delayed graft function, and if there is an acute rejection, especially late acute rejections can have a significant impact on the graft, leading to difficult to control hypertension. CNIs, as all of us know, definitely contribute to hypertension, leading to difficult to control hypertension, and to some extent glucocorticoids. In a busy practice, we should not forget about correctable factors like transplant renal artery stenosis. If it is picked up early and if it is significant, if we set it right, probably we can gain control over hypertension and prevent further graft dysfunction. Chronic allograft nephropathy definitely is not an easy one to deal with. We will come to that in my next slide. So coming to the KDOKI recommendation for management of hypertension in a graft that is post-transplant, first and foremost is lifestyle modification, which applies to everyone. And the first line of drug would be calcium channel blocker. Though there is a recommendation not to use much of diltiazem and verapamil, many centers in India use diltiazem. One is to maybe because of proteinuria. More important in the early transplant is diltiazem interacts with CNI, and in fact we will be happy if we can reduce CNI dosage to cut costs. So if we are doing that, then we need to monitor the CNI levels very, very carefully and make sure we are not shooting the calcineurin levels to very high, leading to toxicity. So when somebody is on diltiazem and these drugs which can interact with CNI, we need to be more diligent. Vellore group used to use ketoconazole for building up the CNI, that especially in the cyclosporin era. I'm not sure now they are doing that. In cyclosporin era, they used to add everyone with ketoconazole so that they can come down with cyclosporin as low as 30% of the regular dose. Whenever there is proteinuria and diabetes, try to use ASARB. Some of us we may forget adding ASARB in our regular practice, because especially in the early transplant, we may not use ASARBs. We may be starting off with calcium channel blockers. We want graft function to settle down. But once there is onset of very early proteinuria, or if somebody has any cardiovascular problems or diabetes, definitely ASARBs have renal protection even in renal transplant setting. If they are known cardiovascular disease, consider using beta blockers, which will become first-line antihypertensive agents. When somebody is on ASARB or beta blocker, along with tacrolimus, we need to monitor closely potassium, because as we know, both of these can increase the potassium levels. So the guideline goal of treatment would be to keep the blood pressure less than 130/80, to start with lifestyle modification, calcium channel blockers to begin with, and wherever possible, try to add ACE ARBs to reduce the proteinuria. If there is cardiovascular disease, add beta blocker. If you are not very big fan of diltiazem and verapamil, maybe better to avoid. In the tacrolimus era, I don't think you need to add diltiazem to build the levels, because even with a small dose of tacrolimus, you can actually build the levels very well nowadays. Next important factor is dyslipidemia, many times forgotten in a transplant. So don't forget to get a lipid profile, keep the lipids under control. It is quite common to have hyperlipidemia. As high as 80% of transplant recipients have hyperlipidemia and dyslipidemia. The goals of treatment, it again goes by NCEP recommendation. So lifestyle modification, consider using statins, avoid fibrates. As you can see in the alert trial, they had seen the reduction in incidence of myocardial infarctions, cardiac death, and lower LDLs will definitely prevent cardiovascular morbidity and mortality. Patients with hypertriglyceridemia, you can consider fibrate derivatives, but we have to be careful in transplant setting. Avoid bile acid sequestrants. Monitor for hepatitis, myositis, and rhabdomyolysis whenever somebody you are starting on statins. Fibrates, I don't use much of fibrates in a transplant setting, very difficult to monitor. Ezetimibe is a very good drug, especially to bring down LDL, even to some extent hypertriglyceridemia, in combination with statins. Most of the group of this ezetimibe is not available as a single drug. It is available as a combination with an atorvastatin. So it is a very good drug. In fact, people have forgotten about this. It's a very good drug to bring down LDL and also triglyceride. So this is the NCEP recommendation, where you try to keep the cholesterol less than 200, triglycerides less than 150. Start with lifestyle modifications, add statins, and be careful when we are using these, and monitor for hepatitis, myositis, and rhabdomyolysis. Diabetes, definitely all of us would have encountered in a transplant setting. If somebody has a CGN, and we don't expect diabetes, but they may develop no DAT after transplant. And it is as high as 25 to 40% post-transplant develop a new onset of diabetes in any center. So we need to monitor them closely for the hyperglycemia. And it definitely has a long-term risk for cardiovascular morbidity also after the transplant. And no DAT as such has a deleterious effects on overall patient survival and graft survival. The goal is as equal to any other patient. Try to keep sub 7 HbA1c. The risk factors include one is weight gain, which happens immediately after transplant. Many times even people feel the graft itself can add to gluconeogenesis and can lead to no DAT. There are many studies to show that. Immunosuppressive medicines like tacrolimus and steroids contribute. And one reason commonly which is not recognized is hepatitis C, which can has increased incidence of new onset diabetes after transplantation. And of course, with the family history, the chances of developing no DAT is higher. Management, again, with lifestyle modification, and we go by ADA guidelines, and we may have to modify immunosuppressive regimen and try to taper the steroids faster, and reduction of exposure to tacrolimus, which may be difficult in the early transplant period when we want to maintain the tacrolimus level. Chronic hyperglycemia, we need to follow ADA guidelines and need to treat to achieve the target of HbA1c of less than 7. If still we are not able to control, try to add oral hypoglycemic agents, add a combination, and if we don't have a choice, add insulin. Don't shy away from adding insulin, because patients may resist initially, but getting the sugars under control is very important in the initial part. Though there is no specific recommendation which oral agents can be used safely, depends again by the GFR. Metformin also is safe in patients with good graft function. And don't forget other diabetes related complications and other peripheral vascular disease, eye and heart and foot care. So this is the KDIGO recommendation, what to maintain HbA1c, we already discussed about. And don't forget about obesity. Try to keep the BMI of less than 30 ideally, and with lifestyle modification, and many times try to refer to the dietitian. Paediatric surgery would be an extreme step. We wouldn't recommend in the initial part. Try to manage with lifestyle modification and increased calorie burning. So tobacco usage I've already spoken about. Definitely counsel all the patients and the family against tobacco usage, smoking, and we need to reinforce and reiterate whenever they come to see us. Many times we may think everything is going on well. When you are seeing your transplant patient in your regular practice, maybe just bring up the topic of whether you're using tobacco, whether you're having alcohol, how is your lifestyle. So these are very important because we may be concentrating on creatinine and their hypertension and immunosuppression, but don't forget about the traditional risk factors. Once there is chronic kidney disease set in a graft dysfunction, don't forget about anemia and bone metabolism. Anemia is quite common in post-transplant, occurs as high as 30 to 40%. And the goal should be again same like a CKD 11 to 12, 10 to 11. And we need to screen them for anemia. If there is any unexplained anemia, see if there is any blood loss like stool occult blood, look for iron studies, try to replace iron. Don't forget that in a transplant setting also. So we need to follow if there is any active hemolysis going on, whether there is any drug-induced hemolysis which can be corrected. And if they are iron deficients, don't shy away from using IV iron and erythropoietin whenever there is a need, and don't overshoot the hemoglobin. Even KDOQI recommends the same. Keep the hemoglobin 11 to 12, replace IV iron and consider erythropoietin. Don't forget about bone. Many times we may forget bone in a post-transplant setting. Definitely bones are affected post-transplant. We keep them on CNI, we keep them on steroids. Many times people may develop very sedentary lifestyle. So this increases the risk for fracture. The fracture rates after transplant is as high as 6 to 45%. So most of the times it is in the appendicular skeleton, especially feet, hands, and things like that. So try to correct all these. So the factors which contribute to post-transplant bone disease are, one is already if somebody had chronic kidney disease or has received some steroids or something similar to that, they may have pre-existing renal osteodystrophy. Somebody is on long-term dialysis, they may have pre-existing renal osteodystrophy. So again, we put them on corticosteroids and hormone deficiency and persistent hyperparathyroidism, which may go on even post-transplant. Many studies have shown almost 40% of the patients after transplant also continue to have persistent hyperparathyroidism. All these we need to address so that the post-transplant bone loss can be cut down. So management includes, don't forget about doing DEXA scan and trying to replace vitamin D, monitor the PTH, and try to replace calcium and phosphorus. And definitely post-transplant risk is higher, especially with the steroid usage. Use of steroid avoidance protocol can be considered in specific situation, not very popular nowadays. It may help in both cutting down NODAT, obesity, and also fracture risk. In the early bone loss, try to replace with vitamin D analogs and bisphosphonates wherever indicated, and try to replace the calcium. Vitamin D can be monitored and replaced appropriately. So also don't forget about non-pharmacological methods to prevent bone loss. You encourage them to be physically active, weight-resistant training, and improve their balance and mobility. And all of you are aware that transplant games do happen, and encourage your patients to participate in these so that they can look forward to something and they can train themselves so that they are physically fit for to keep their bones fit and active. Coming to the transplant related complications like allograft dysfunction, infection, and malignancy. Allograft dysfunction is a major problem in long-term complication of a transplant patient, and we need to assess transplant graft function on a regular basis, which includes creatinine value and also urine analysis to look for any early onset proteinuria, and so that we can take necessary actions. As the kidney functions come down, as allograft dysfunction increases, the patient and graft outcomes also come down. In the late post-transplant period, don't forget about acute kidney injury, which may happen, especially somebody coming in with sepsis, somebody coming in with the cardiovascular problems or infection, hypertension. It may lead to acute graft dysfunction. So we need to be very carefully monitoring. And slow decline over a period of time in allograft function is known as chronic allograft dysfunction, which all of you are aware. The risk factors for acute, as I mentioned, volume depletion. Don't forget drugs. Whenever somebody is hypotensive, try to reduce the CNI, take off ACE/ARB if they are on. Don't use NSAIDs, and treat infections aggressively so that we can prevent chronic damage happening. When acute is not treated appropriately, it may develop into chronic infection and chronic scarring of the graft. In chronic allograft dysfunction, chronic allograft nephropathy is number one cause, and CNI nephrotoxicity also can happen. So we need to balance the CNI levels. And chronic active antibody mediated rejection, many of us may not have control. Here again, if it is under immunosuppression, or if we are trying to keep CNI levels low, it can trigger a chronic active antibody mediated rejection. So we need to balance that. Recurrence and de novo GNs, we need to keep an eye for that. Whenever we are seeing a patient with even a small rise in creatinine, a new onset proteinuria, better to try and understand what is the cause of that. And if you don't know the reason, better to biopsy early. And for this reason, if you know the native kidney disease, it may help us in managing a post-transplant patient. So treatment of chronic allograft nephropathy, we should focus on primary prevention of acute rejection. For a period of time, we need to also cut down on CNA exposure so that the kidney lasts longer. Whenever somebody has proteinuria, chronic allograft nephropathy, try to use ACE/ARBs, which may help in prolonging the graft survival. CNA nephrotoxicity plays a significant role in progressive kidney dysfunction. Try to limit or reduce the usage of CNI. Early withdrawal may be a little difficult. CNI withdrawal is not something which is being recommended in the current times. The current recommendations are to try to keep CNI, don't withdraw, maybe keep it at a lower level. Minimization is more important than withdrawal in especially graft function to be lasting longer. Whenever somebody has better creatinine clearance, and if there is any early indication of CNA toxicity, sirolimus-based or everolimus-based therapy can be considered. Patients who are at high risk of rejection, immunological risk, definitely need regular screening of DSA, though not many studies to support, but most of the people who are in transplant practice do feel regular DSA screening in high-risk patients may help in adjusting the immunosuppression so that we prevent chronic active antibody-mediated rejection. Coming to the GN, which can recur or a de novo, most of the times we may not have much to offer except if it is very early recurrence where we can use specific modalities to treat. Whenever there is suspicion of GN recurrence, don't forget to take an extra core for immunofluorescence, which will help us in treating the condition, and if possible, try to get an electron microscopy. Coming to post-transplant long-term infections, these infections are overall determined by what is the net immunosuppression we are using. And as I mentioned, immunosuppression is a very delicate balance. If we overdo it, we may end up developing infection. If we underplay, then they may develop chronic antibody-mediated rejection. So basically, the infection episodes may be higher in people who are exposed to various risk factors like donor-derived infections, whether it is recipient-derived infections or any nosocomial infection and community infection. Antimicrobial prophylaxis go a long way. All of us do use trimethoprim sulfamethoxazole for prophylaxis. The recommendation for using this is more or less lifelong, at least minimum for 1 year. If we use, it prevents so many infections, almost 6 infections, which I'm sure all of you are aware. And if somebody has self-allergy, these drugs can be used. Rarely we do use this. And CMV prophylaxis, don't forget, especially with the availability of oral valganciclovir, it prevents the CMV definitely if we use it at the right dosage, and try to use it for a minimum of 100 days. If cost is not an issue, the recommendation is to use 200 days after a transplant. We need to routinely monitor the patients for any remote infection, including urinary tract infection, especially people who have received recent increased immunosuppression, any pulse steroids or any rejection therapy. We need to monitor them and try to vaccinate all the patients before sending for a transplant, especially live vaccines. And don't forget about yearly influenza vaccine, pneumococcal vaccine, and add COVID vaccine to this list. Coming to the malignancy, transplant recipients are definitely at high risk of developing malignancy due to chronic usage of immunosuppressive medications. And the significant risk factors for malignancy is again higher the age group, net immunosuppression, chronic viral infections, and smoking and traditional risk factors. So we need to screen all the patients, annual skin exam, annual ultrasounds, and annual screening for any remote infections, remote malignancies like prostate specific, do a stool occult blood, and don't forget about mammogram and breast examination in a female patient and pap smear. And colonoscopy is rarely indicated depending on the patient's condition. If there is a need for it, don't shy away from doing colonoscopy. Again, whenever somebody has post-transplant malignancy or PTLD, we need to adjust the immunosuppressive medicine, and we may have to consider switching from CNI to sirolimus. General health guidelines, don't forget about these. Pregnancy should be planned in transplant patient. Definitely, we need to inform if it's a female patient that we need to take off few medications which may not be safe. If somebody is on ACRB, if they're planning for a pregnancy, take it out. And if somebody is on mycophenolate, as we all know, mycophenolate and everolimus, we don't have safety data. So try to switch them to azathioprine. Tacrolimus, many years people considered may not be safe, but tacrolimus is safe during pregnancy and it can be continued. And steroids are safe, as we all know. So pay close attention to medical complications during pregnancy. Keep a close watch on hypertension, development of PAH or chronic hypertension, and the risk of infections and anemia. Coming to lifestyle modifications, I've already discussed about smoking, lifestyle, and reducing the obesity. We need to counsel them repeatedly to prevent these complications. Yes, definitely transplantation has its toxicities. We need to choose which toxicity is better. I'm not saying one is better than the other, but definitely transplantation gives better quality of life for a patient compared to dialysis. Survival is better. People can get pregnant, fertility rates improve, people can get back to work, but don't forget about concentrating on post-transplant complications so that our patients last longer. And the dream of all nephrologists would be to have a functioning graft whenever a patient is surviving, and the longest the patient survives, we are all happy. And if suppose any unfortunate incident happens for our patient and he succumbs, we would all like to have the patient pass away with a functioning graft. So that is the dream of most of the nephrologists. I'm sure all of you agree with that. What is the future of transplantation? I'm sure a lot of reading has to be done by all of you, including the xenotransplant, artificial kidney. It may be a question in your exam. So next level of transplant is already happening. So we need to scale up here. One is simultaneous kidney pancreas transplantation, and what are the complications associated with that. So probably that will take another class, so I won't go into the details of that. And dual liver kidney transplant, dual organ like kidney heart transplant, so which has its own complications. I'm sure many of you also will be managing immunosuppression in a heart transplant, and I'm sure people who are in Cochin and areas where they are doing hand transplant, I'm told the immunosuppression is managed by the nephrology team. So try to become masters of immunosuppression, and you understand the long-term complications of this so that you can treat these patients in your day-to-day practice. To conclude, kidney transplant recipients represent a unique set of patients with complex medical issues, which only a nephrologist and the person who is dealing with the transplant patients can understand. Nobody else will be able to understand. So as the patients survive longer with the functioning grafts, we have to take the responsibility to take care of their long-term complications. So hence we need to partner with community nephrologists, community practitioners, and primary care physicians so that the continuity of care is there, and don't make sure that we don't forget on continuing immunosuppression, If suppose there is an emergency in a transplant patient, how to manage, we need to grill the patients and tell them how to take care of these when you are not around. It is very crucial that we as providers develop all these necessary skills to manage a patient with post-transplant with multiple problems, and we should also have adequate knowledge about these to ensure there is optimal health maintained in this. These patients need very diligent watchfulness, and then we need to have an early intervention related to transplant or even cardiovascular risk factors. As we all know, cardiovascular death is the #1 cause of death in a transplant recipient. Of course, this should be done at various transplant levels, and if you follow published guidelines, I'm sure you can never go wrong in your management of a transplant patient. Thank you very much, and I would like to thank RPG for the opportunity again given for me on the second session of postgraduate teaching. I'd be happy to take any questions. This is the Manipal Hospital. I'm sure most of you might have seen Manipal Hospital, Bangalore.
So thank you so much, sir, for giving such a beautiful and informative session.
Thank you.
I would like to ask participants to type their question and answer into Q&A box. They can ask questions to Dr. Vishwanath, sir.
Question, I think.
Yeah. So we would be happy to take those questions.
What is the monitoring of lipid levels in a post-transplant? I'm sure to begin with, you can probably do first in the 3 months, and then after that, at least once in 3 to 6 months. And again, it depends on the risk factor of the patient. If somebody has metabolic syndrome, hyperglycemia, or any family history, we would maybe more frequent. At least 3 to 6 months is the recommended time period for the frequency of lipid levels in post-transplant. Septran, we would like to give lifelong. That is the recommendation actually, but at least for an year after transplant, or if there is any change of clinical indication. So the question is how long we give Septran and how long we give valganciclovir. Septran at least for an year, or if somebody has developed a rejection and you have given up the immunosuppression, so at least 6 to 12 months after the episode, definitely it helps a lot. And the second question is valganciclovir. Valganciclovir should be given for at least 100 days. If cost is not an issue, 200 days. Recommendation is 200 days. How frequently do we monitor GN? One is, first of all, if we know the native kidney disease, it is more easier to monitor. If it is an FSGS and if it is a malignant course, you need to monitor as early as within a week's time. So if there is any doubt, get a 24-hour protein and biopsy the kidney and consider doing immunofluorescence. Nowadays, we are also seeing a lot of IgA recurrence. So again, if you know the native kidney disease very well, so we can monitor them more closely. If underlying native kidney disease is not known, at least once in 3 to 6 months, get an urine analysis to see if there is any new onset proteinuria. If there is any new onset proteinuria, consider biopsying early. Is DEXA scan indicated for post-transplant MBD? Yes, definitely. In fact, we have done a thesis topic for one of the postgraduate where DEXA scan definitely gave us a lot of idea about the bone, and we tried to correct vitamin D and other correctable things which can be dealt with in mineral bone disease. Ideal time to start Septran and valganciclovir, immediate. It should be started immediate once the graft function is normal. If you have any problems in the initial period like counts and things like that, you can wait for some time. But the sooner you start, the better it is, especially Septran and valganciclovir. Steroid-free, how frequently DEXA scan, how frequently monitor GN that I have done, and
why don't I read the question for Sir Mangesh? It's better.
Yeah, I will.
Yes, next question is steroid-free immunosuppression, isn't it, Mangesh? Yes.
Steroid-free immunosuppression.
Steroid-free immunosuppression in a transplant. So steroid-free is definitely a great proposition. In fact, it came in a big way, and US and Australia and Singapore, they were the leaders in this. But I'm not sure in India whether it is practically doable. I have a couple of pediatric transplants where we have done steroid-free. They have done very well, but you should accept the risk here, because in our country, if you are not monitoring very closely And if your initial induction program is not very good, so you may have problems with steroid free. There are definitely a lot of benefits, like avoids obesity, it gives good growth for the children, and of course no DAT to some extent. But it is an individual decision. If you are very confident on steroid free, you can definitely use. But if you are doing steroid free, your induction program should be very robust.
Yes, Arun Kumar is asking how is allograft survival in children, overall survival he might be asking.
In children, it is very good. Actually, it again depends on how good you are monitoring. As we all know, adolescents may be sometimes non-compliant. That's the reason we need to bring in parents, caretakers, make sure they take the immunosuppression very well. And in fact, allograft survival in children is actually better than adults. So, but of course, as my sir says, Kishore Babu sir, who is also a pediatric nephrologist, whenever you are planning for a transplant in a child, please tell the parents that that is not the end of the story. You may have to plan for 2 transplants in a lifetime. The younger the child, because kidneys is not going to last lifelong. So suppose you do a transplant for a 10-year-old kid, he will lose the kid when he is around 25. He will lose the kidney when the child grows to 25 to 30 years of age. So that's the time, that's the prime time of anybody's life. So you need to plan another transplant. So we need to educate this for the patient, so that we have better overall outlook for these. Parents should not think you do one transplant and forget about it. So in general, in children, the graft survival is good.
Right. One more the question asked by Sita Mutalik. Sir, which CCB would you recommend?
CCB, I would actually, my current preference is cilnidipine. Amlodipine again gives a lot of edema, can increase proteinuria. Between nifedipine and cilnidipine, I'm okay with the both.
And I would like to add question to this question, sir. There are reports of benidipine and azilnidipine found to be renoprotective.
But the availability, cost, and all these things, ease of use. So we are trying to cut costs in these patients. So I don't know the cost of benidipine. I have not.
It's similar, but they claim about anti-proteinuric effect, and azilnidipine also they claim that. As you know that cilnidipine is have proven anti-proteinuric effect.
Yes. Maybe yes. If it's available and if you are comfortable, you can definitely use. How to treat acute CNA toxicity? First and foremost is to cut down the dosage and to identify. Identifying is more important, especially CNA toxicity. You may have very, very early clues like hyperkalemia, hyperuricemia. Somebody is coming with very mild increase in creatinine, what we call as creeping creatinine, which is very typical of CNA toxicity. The minute you detect, we need to cut down on the dosage and estimation of CNI, which will help in detecting. In very severe toxicity, then don't forget about monitoring LDH, monitoring hemoglobin, look for hemolysis if there is any HUS-like picture. That's Aruna's, Dr. Aruna's question.
Dr. Nirmal is asking that what is the creatinine level of TAC to start post-transplant?
Actually, there is no recommendation to wait for creatinine level to start TAC. The sooner you start is better, but it again goes with your personal experience. If you are using good induction like ATG, you can introduce TAC little later. If you are not using any induction, especially if you are not using ATG, try to start creatinine tacrolimus as early as possible. Don't wait for creatinine. We start on the day of transplant. Some people start, in fact, 3 to 4 days before. Dr. Mani's unit used to start about a week before. So it depends on your comfort level. I would prefer to start the sooner, the better. If we are giving ATG, we start on day 2 or day 3 when ATG is getting over. If there is no ATG induction, we introduce on the day of transplant, irrespective of the creatinine. If your urine outputs are good, if patient is doing well, if the graft function you think is good, don't wait for creatinine to settle down, start immediately. Because you need to build tacrolimus. It will take about 2-3 days for the tacrolimus levels to achieve. Just one dose is not going to help in getting the levels to 8 or 12 or whatever you want. So it may take 2-3 days. So you need to give that time for the patient to build.
Right. Spurti Dasari, Dr. Spurti Dasari is asking that how long we should give Cetron
That
and Valgan prophylaxis.
Answered already. Yeah. Septran and
plasma.
valganciclovir I have answered.
Yeah. And how long should we give bisphosphonates in osteoporosis? And how frequently it has to be done?
Difficult actually. See, bisphosphonates, if you are using, there should be a definite indication for using, especially if there is severe osteoporosis. Yes. But again, DEXA scan to begin with initially, and ideally at least about 6 months to 1 year later to see if your bisphosphonates are working. And bisphosphonate, the usage should be at least for about 2 to 3 years, and then you should not use it continuously. You need to give a break and then restart it after 2 years. So the best drug in the current scenario would be denosumab, which is a better drug, and in fact it has been approved even in CKD. So in even chronic allograft dysfunction you can use. Otherwise, most of the times we may not be able to use regular bisphosphonate because of the graft dysfunction. Denosumab I would actually recommend if there is no other contraindication, but make sure PTH is okay. They are not having adynamic bone disease before you use bisphosphonates and denosumab.
Right. Dr. Aruna Acharya is asking that early post-transplant acute psychosis, how to address?
Quite a common problem, especially once you give steroids for a patient and put them in a transplant ICU, no one is there. Many of them develop psychosis. So we need to be careful with that. Maybe most of the times you'll be able to manage with counseling. Maybe you will need a psychiatrist help and maybe some with antipsychotic drugs. Fluoxetine may be a simple one to start with. Sometimes people can even get out of hands. They may need sedation and things like that in the initial 1 or 2 days. So we need to monitor them closely, and depending on the clinical situation, we may have to take a call on that.
Right. Dr. Shruti is asking how frequent is the recurrence of post-transplant FSGS and how to treat it?
It is quite common. In fact, especially FSGS. If you look at the world literature, the rate of recurrence is as high as 20 to 40%. We had looked at our own data, and we had seen we had a stringent criteria of only taking people who had native kidney biopsy proven FSGS. So we had seen as high as 30% recurrence in post-transplant FSGS. And here again, as I mentioned, the earlier you pick it up, the better it can be treated. So very early recurrence should be treated with plasmapheresis and rituximab. Late recurrence, many times it may not be amenable to any treatment, but definitely can consider rituximab. Late recurrence, not much of role for plasmapheresis. We can consider rituximab and try to keep tacrolimus little higher so that you reduce the proteinuria.
Right. Dr. Spurti is asking once again, what will be the outcome of graft function when we do intervention for TRAs
and venous stenosis? See, basically, venous stenosis is not much seen. I'll answer first TRAS. TRAS is very simple thing to treat. I have many patients. We have picked up TRAS at as early as 3 months, 6 months. Once you fix it, you can actually forget that you have done it. So after 6-7 years, suddenly you realize, oh, this fellow, we have done TRAS and fixed it, and he has a stent in situ because they may be on clopidogrel and aspirin. So it is very simple to treat, and in good hands. The graft should function very well. So once you treat TRAS, you will have two advantages. One is you have good blood pressure control and good graft function. So TRAS is very simple to treat, but you need to pick it up early. When there is venous, there is nothing like venous stenosis. It is more of a venous thrombosis. If it is a venous thrombosis, then it's a bad news. So most of the times it is an acute setting. So we need to look at the cause for that and treat it.
Dr. Spurti is asking one more question. If some patient has TB transplant who completed the therapy RX, is it necessary to give INH prophylaxis?
There are two schools of thought. In India, many people don't believe much in INH prophylaxis. If it has been completely treated, there is no need to give any prophylaxis. If you think it has not been appropriately treated, you can consider INH prophylaxis for about 6 months to 1 year. There is a paper from Vellore where they had used INH prophylaxis in people like this suspicion, where you are using induction or pre-transplant, some suspicion of TB thought was not treated well. The reactivation was much lesser in INH prophylaxis. But again, we need to remember INH interacts with tacrolimus whenever we are using INH. So one school of thought is INH prophylaxis may not completely prevent, and it may be rather easy to identify and treat if they develop tuberculosis later. But if suspicion is higher, you can definitely consider INH prophylaxis and maybe monitor their LFTs and tacrolimus level more closely. Currently, I have 2 patients whom have started an INH prophylaxis, again for the same indication, because the treatment of TB was not very sure, and they're doing okay. It's almost 3 months now.
Right. Dr. Amit Singh has conveyed good evening, and also he is asking question, how to manage post-transplant candidate early 6 months with persistent hypophosphatemia and normal calcium levels?
Most of the times, post-transplant hypophosphatemia, if you are seeing, it could be related to your PTH. Once the graft functions normally, suppose you do a transplant in a patient who has little higher PTH is running around 600, 800, you do transplant. Then what happens is PTH falls, and because of the PTH level pre-transplant being higher, people may develop hypophosphatemia, which may be persistent. The only way to manage is, one is try to correct vitamin D, try to correct PTH, and rarely we may have to use phosphate replacement. It was not available in the earlier times. Now it is easily available. Phosphate oral replacement packets are available. You can use it till the phosphate comes back. Usually it's around first 3 months is the time period where we have critical period in managing hypophosphatemia. Once graft function settle down, once PTH settles down, once MBD is taken care of, phosphorus also will become normal. And as we all know, phosphorus is available in all the proteins. So once you start a normal diet for a patient, phosphorus will get back to normal. And of course, calcium, most of these patients have normal calcium.
Yeah, Dr. Kumar Avijit Dash is asking, is there any role of SGLT2 inhibitor in?
Definitely yes, but there are a lot of skeptical reports. There are recent reports have shown that SGLT2, as we all know, has renoprotection. And in transplant, many of them were worried about fungal infections, urinary tract infections. And if suppose somebody sugars you are not able to get under control, definitely you can consider SGLT2 inhibitor even in transplant. There is recent evidence to show that in post-transplant also it's been safer. But we need to be very watchful when we are using SGLT2 inhibitors because of the previous reports of urinary tract infection, fungal infection.
Yeah. Before we take last question,
yes,
I would like to ask Avinash to activate the post-session exam link. I would like to recommend the students to take this exam. It would be in chat box and QA section. You can see the link. So Dr. Nirmal is asking, when do we add antifungal for transplant patients?
Antifungal, we don't want any systemic antifungal to be given, because as we all know, it may interact with tacrolimus and it may cause tacrolimus lot of fluctuation, which we don't want in the initial period. You can use only a local antifungals like nystatin, swish and swallow, or some cotrimazole paints, which may prevent fungal infections. That should be good enough. You don't need a systemic antifungal in a post-transplant patient.
Yeah. So thank you for addressing this question, sir. Once again, I would remind participants to attend the exam. The exam link is given in chat box. They can open the chat box and they can access the link. Thank you so much, sir. You will be also getting link on your mobile by SMS and as well as by on your email. So, we would request you to attend the exam, and there are exciting prizes, such as certification of participation, and you would be getting the special recognition certificates by the stalwarts in the nephrology, as well as there would be special prizes for students to get assistance during their thesis writing, to analyze their data, and to publish their thesis, original articles, review articles. So there would be special recognition and the awards related to scientific publications. So hope it is visible to all participants.
Yes, sir. Yes. So I would request Sanjeev, sir.
Thanks, Dr. Vishwanath, sir. It was a pleasure hearing you, and we could see the students' enthusiasm with a lot of questions. I think a lot of questions are there still in the mind, and I think we will give your email if anybody wants to join with you post this session for any kind of a query, they can reach you. And I'll just take 30 seconds again to just introduce another unique initiative started during this pandemic called as RPG Sir. It's a digital service to be given to the doctors anytime, anywhere doctor support initiative. We just took birth in the pandemic due to the not teaching the doctors. Next slide, please. The name says that RPG Sir, you have to just log in through RPG Sir. This, you have to enter your registered mobile number, and after that you will get a 4-digit OTP, and then automatically it's like a Arogya Setu app. You will go to the next page, that is the page of services of RPG Sir. Next slide, please. So here you can see 6 services we are offering through digital channel of RPG Sir. Though it started with COVID-19 care, just only to providing the doctors with N95 masks, PPE kit, gloves. But now we have added so many services into that: scientific updates, abstract submission, high impact factor journals, like trending topics in nephrology, like ABO incompatibility transplantation, artificial kidney update, AKI and biomarkers, all those trending topics, as good as August issue. Updated articles are there in that. You can just go to link it and you can just download and also send it to your email ID. And also scientific support and COVID-19 one source. Anything under earth, what are in COVID-19 across globe is happening. Any protocol, any Indian protocol, any new drug, any treatment of COVID one source is being uploaded there. The next set of service, next slide please, is scientific support. It is one of the unique services. There is preloaded scientific slide decks are already in there. And those who are being generally used regularly in the CME programs, you can just go to that and you can just download this, or else you can email it to your email ID and later on you can read it. And case study by expert like Dr. Vishwanath, probably he has some case studies he shared with us, and we give it here so that students or doctors can go it and download and they can go through that. We also do it here, public case studies, publication, and also individual case studies. Next slide, please. Yeah, you can see the entire list of article slide downloads like HLH, a lot of articles are there. Azotherapion in renal transplants, almost 23 PPTs are available online. Next, please. So here you can, I've already highlighted you the published case studies, international and also domestic, any doctors, even nephrologists case studies are already there here, you can see. Next. Here also another important factor, any EU webinar or important topics we discuss or we conduct in digital platform, we keep it here, like the first program of nephrology postgraduate program done by Professor Chaco, and one of the unique program we have conducted during the pandemic by Professor Chaco and Professor Kher about role of azotherapion in renal transplantation. Recently, we have done decoding of Athena study with Professor Gang and Professor Sundar. So that is also there, and also today's program also link will be uploaded there. So anytime you can go and see that program online also. So this is about RPG Sir. My team will meet you, and your online, first you have to register your mobile number, then only you can log in it. And currently around 10,000 doctors across specialties there in this platform. Be it rheumatology, urology, nephrology, gastroenterology, dermatology, diabetic, cardiology, around 10,000 doctors are there. Looking into the very good response, now we are just shifting to an app form. Within a probably 1 month's time, you will get an app form so that all the notification, everything you can get through RPG Sir. My team will meet you shortly in person to just unfold this about the app services. Thank you so much.
Right. Sir, what's your concluding remarks for the students who have attended today?
Concluding remarks, as I said in the initial period, transplant is not a sprint. So it is a marathon. So we need to make sure that our patients survive longer with the working graft with minimal complications. So we need to address all the complications one by one. Keep your minds open and don't forget about traditional risk factors, including obesity, lifestyle modification, smoking, of course, immunosuppression. I'm sure all of you would be concentrating on. And we need to be very diligent in handling a transplant patient. And all the best to all our students, and my regards to all of them, especially working during the COVID times, who have been working very hard. Hopefully COVID is now down. Hopefully it stays the same for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Before I would invite Sanjeev sir to deliver the thank you note, I would like to once again inform students that they will be getting the video link of this program as well as scientific notes which are based on the today's PowerPoint presentation done by Dr. Vishwanath sir. I would like to invite Sanjeev sir to deliver vote of thank you. Over to you, sir.
Yeah, thank you so much at the end, sir. First and foremost, it is delighted to thank Dr. Vishwanath. Thank you so much for gracing the occasion, sir. And it was really wonderful. A lot of students could able to hear you, and I could able to see the enthusiasm on this. And extremely thankful from RPG Life Sciences side, sir. And we love to associate it with you any other program in future in this series, sir. Definitely. And to the student who have joined, actually, we have kept 7 sessions, but we have kept 2 sessions open. And we would invite, we are conducting a Google form survey from all the participants who have done the registration. And we will take up 2 topics which they suggest. And I think we will add 2 into that. And we'll try to make it a 10 series of program apart from 7 around 2 to 3 suggested by the doctors across India. And thank you very much at the end, and good night and stay safe. And what Dr. Vishwanath was telling, a humble pranam from RPG Life Sciences side for all the doctors for doing wonderful job at this COVID times. And I just wanted to end it with a note that during the pandemic, we have heard one sentence that you can see temples are closed because there is somebody is there in white coat outside the temple. So that is nothing but the doctors who has done wonderfully well for the mankind during this COVID time. Our salute and pranam to each one of you. Thank you so much and good night.
Thank you.